"Sir, they're in the dump," the homeless girl told a Hell's Angel. What he found changed his life forever. The autumn wind whispered through the cemetery, rustling fallen leaves across the weathered headstones. Vince McAllister stood motionless, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the small granite marker that bore his son's names. His leather jacket, adorned with the worn patches of his Hell's Angels days, did little to shield him from the hollow ache in his chest. 2 years, he murmured, his voice rough like gravel. 2 years without answers. The headstone was simple, yet each engraved letter felt like a knife twisting in his heart. Ryan and Danny McAllister, beloved sons. The dates carved beneath their names were too close together, marking lives cut tragically short. Or so everyone believed. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Vince's calloused fingers traced the cold stone, a ritual he'd performed countless times since the police had declared the case closed. His son's room remained exactly as they'd left it. Twin beds with superhero sheets, scattered toys, and half-finished drawings pinned to the walls. He couldn't bring himself to change anything, holding on to hope like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. The evening sun painted long shadows across the cemetery grounds, but Vince barely noticed the passing time. His mind wandered to happier days, teaching the boys to ride their bikes, their gleeful laughter as they raced down the sidewalk, the proud grins when they'd finally managed without training wheels. "I should have been there," he whispered, his words carried away by the breeze. The guilt was a constant companion, gnawing at him day and night. He'd been at a club meeting when it happened, when his world had shattered into a million pieces. The police had searched for months. Every lead went cold. Every possible witness came up empty. The case had slowly slipped from the headlines, and eventually the authorities had convinced themselves, and tried to convince him, that the boys were gone forever. But Vince knew better. A father's heart couldn't be fooled so easily. He'd seen too many nights where the emptiness in their rooms seemed to pulse with unspoken possibilities. He'd walked too many streets, following shadows that looked like small running figures, only to find nothing but his own desperate hopes. His large hands, marked with the scars and tattoos of his rough life, clenched into fists. The gold ring on his finger caught the fading sunlight, a reminder of promises made and a life he'd tried to build for his family. Now it felt like a weight, pulling him down into depths of grief he couldn't escape. Vince sank to his knees, not caring about the damp grass soaking through his jeans. The cemetery was quiet, except for distant traffic and the occasional cry of a bird. Here, alone with his pain, he could let the tough exterior crack just a little. A single tear traced down his weathered cheek, disappearing into his beard. "I miss you boys," he said softly, placing a small toy car next to the headstone, the kind the twins used to collect. "I'm sorry I failed you." The wind picked up slightly, sending leaves skittering across the graves. The setting sun cast long fingers of light through the trees, creating shifting patterns on the ground. In this moment of raw vulnerability, Vince felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned, startled by the unexpected contact, to find a small figure standing behind him. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, looked up at him with knowing eyes. Her clothes were ragged, her feet bare despite the autumn chill. Despite his intimidating appearance, she showed no fear. "Sir," she said in a clear, steady voice. "They're in the dump." Vince blinked hard, his mind struggling to process the words that had just come from this tiny, bedraggled girl. The cemetery seemed to spin around him, and he steadied himself with one hand against the cold granite of the headstone. What did you say?" His voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the rustling leaves. The girl, small and fragile-looking with tangled hair and dirt-smudged cheeks, didn't flinch under his intense gaze. Instead, she met his eyes with a steadiness that seemed far beyond her years. "Your boys," she repeated clearly. "They're in the dump. I saw them." Vince's heart thundered in his chest. He'd heard similar things before, well-meaning people claiming they'd seen the twins, offering false hopes that always led nowhere. Each time, it had torn him apart a little more. But something about this girl was different. There was no uncertainty in her voice, no hesitation in her stance. "How do you know they're my boys?" he asked, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. His hands trembled slightly as he rose to his full height, towering over the small figure before him. "Twin boys," she said simply, pointing to the headstone. "Ryan has a scar over his right eye. Danny's got a gap between his front teeth." She spoke with such certainty that Vince felt his knees go weak. Those details hadn't been in any news reports. Who are you?" Vince managed to ask, his throat tight with suppressed hope. "I'm Sophie," she replied, tugging at the frayed sleeve of her oversized sweater. "I know where they are. I can show you." She turned slightly, gesturing toward an alley visible beyond the cemetery gates. Vince hesitated, years of disappointment warring with the desperate need to believe. His mind raced through all the possibilities. Was this some kind of cruel joke, a trap? Or could it possibly be real? The rational part of him said to call the police, to not trust this strange child who'd appeared out of nowhere. But something in Sophie's eyes held him. There was no malice there, no deception, only a kind of weary knowledge that no child should possess. "Please," Sophie said quietly, reaching out to tug gently at his jacket sleeve. "They need help. They're scared and hungry." That simple statement broke through Vince's paralysis. The thought of his boys, if they were really his boys, being scared and hungry was more than he could bear. He took a step forward, then another, following as Sophie began to walk toward the cemetery gates. "It's not far," she assured him, her bare feet making no sound on the path. "Just down there." She pointed again to the alley, a narrow gap between two brick buildings that cast deep shadows in the fading light. Vince's heart pounded harder with each step. Hope, that dangerous and beautiful thing he'd tried so hard to suppress, flickered to life in his chest. He knew he should be more cautious, should question this more, but the possibility that his boys might be alive drove him forward. "You're sure?" he asked one last time, his voice thick with emotion. "You're absolutely sure you saw them?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "I'm sure," she said. "They need their dad." The alley stretched before them like a dark tunnel, lined with overflowing trash cans and discarded cardboard boxes. Vince's heavy boots crunched on broken glass as he followed Sophie deeper into the shadows. The small girl moved with surprising confidence, navigating the debris without hesitation. "There," Sophie pointed to a large metal dumpster pressed against the brick wall. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet alley, it seemed to echo. Vince's hands shook as he approached the dumpster. The metallic smell of rust mixed with rotting garbage made his stomach turn. He placed his hands on the cold edge, his muscles tensing as he prepared to look inside. Part of him wanted to run away, afraid of finding nothing but trash and having his hopes crushed once again. Sophie stood quietly beside him, her presence somehow reassuring. "It's okay," she murmured. "They're in there." Taking a deep breath, Vince pushed himself up and peered over the edge. At first, all he saw was darkness and shadows. Then, As his eyes adjusted, movement caught his attention. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a torn garbage bag, two small figures huddled together. His heart stopped. Two pairs of eyes stared back at him, eyes he'd seen in his dreams every night for the past 2 years. Ryan's scar, the one above his right eyebrow from falling off his bike when he was 4, was clearly visible even through the dirt on his face. Danny's familiar gap-toothed expression, though twisted with fear, was unmistakable. "Oh God," Vince choked out, tears streaming down his face. "My boys! My boys!" The twins pressed closer together, trembling. They looked so small, so fragile, nothing like the laughing, energetic children they'd been before. Their clothes hung in tatters, their faces smudged with grime and tears. They were alive, but the spark in their eyes had dimmed to a flicker. Without hesitation, Vince reached into the dumpster. "It's okay," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions threatening to tear him apart. "It's Dad. I'm here now. I'm here." Ryan, always the more cautious one, shrank back, but Danny, after a moment's hesitation, reached out a tiny, dirt-covered hand. Vince gently grasped it, his large hand engulfing his son's small one. "I've got you," he whispered, carefully lifting Danny out first. The boy was lighter than he remembered. Too light. As soon as Danny's feet touched the ground, Vince reached back in for Ryan, who didn't resist this time. Holding both boys close, Vince sank to his knees in the alley. They were real. They were alive. Their small bodies trembled against his chest as he wrapped his arms around them, trying to shield them from whatever horrors they'd endured. "Sophie," he called out, his voice thick with gratitude. Thank you for—" But when he looked up, the alley was empty. The mysterious girl had vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared, leaving no trace behind. Vince stared into the darkness where she'd been standing just moments ago, confusion mixing with the overwhelming joy and pain in his heart. Who was she? How had she known? But his boys pressed closer, their small hands clutching his jacket, and all other questions faded away. His sons were alive. They were here. Nothing else mattered. The drive home felt surreal. Vince kept glancing in his rearview mirror, afraid his sons might disappear if he looked away for too long. Ryan and Danny huddled together in the back seat of his old pickup truck, their small bodies pressed against the door, as far from him as possible. The streetlights cast intermittent shadows across their faces, highlighting their hollow cheeks and fearful eyes. Vince's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. His modest house wasn't far, but every minute felt like an hour. Questions burned in his mind. Where had they been? What had happened to them? Who had taken them? But he knew better than to ask. Not now. Not when they looked ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. The truck pulled into the driveway of his small, one-story house. The porch light cast a warm glow, but the boys flinched at the brightness. Vince's heart squeezed in his chest. "We're home," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. Neither boy responded. They didn't move until he opened the back door, and even then, they climbed out with careful, calculated movements, like wounded animals expecting a trap. Inside, the house felt too quiet, too empty. Vince led them to the bathroom, where he'd given them countless baths when they were younger. Now they stood rigid and scared, their clothes hanging in tatters around their thin frames. "Let's get you cleaned up," he said, running warm water into the tub. He added some bubble bath, remembering how they used to love making bubble beards and hats. This time there were no giggles, no playful splashing. Ryan wouldn't look at him as Vince helped them out of their filthy clothes. Danny's arms were covered in bruises, some old, some new. Vince had to turn away for a moment, pressing his fist against his mouth to keep from crying out in rage. The boys allowed themselves to be cleaned, but their compliance wasn't trust. It was resignation. They moved mechanically, like they'd learned that resistance only made things worse. Vince's gentle touches seemed to confuse them, as if kindness had become foreign. After their bath, he dressed them in old t-shirts he'd never had the heart to throw away. The shirts hung loose on their thin frames, making them look even smaller. In the kitchen, he warmed up some soup, remembering the doctor's warnings about feeding too much too quickly to malnourished children. They ate slowly, carefully, like they expected the food to be taken away. Ryan's hands shook as he lifted the spoon to his mouth. Danny kept his eyes fixed on the bowl, not daring to look up. Neither spoke a word. Finally, Vince led them to their old bedroom. He'd kept it exactly as it was the day they disappeared. Twin beds with superhero sheets, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, drawings taped to the walls. But the boys showed no recognition, no comfort in these familiar surroundings. They climbed into their beds without prompting, lying stiff and straight, eyes wide open in the dim light. Vince sat in the old rocking chair between their beds, his large frame making the chair seem tiny. The silence felt heavy, suffocating. He watched as they lay there, neither sleeping nor moving, just staring at the ceiling. These weren't the boisterous, loving boys who used to climb into his lap for bedtime stories. These were shadows, shells, broken pieces of his children. The joy of finding them alive was now mixed with a deep, aching sadness for what had been done to them. Vince had always considered himself a strong man, capable of handling any situation. But now, watching his traumatized sons, he felt completely helpless. Could he protect them from harm that had already been done? How could he help them trust again when they couldn't even look him in the eye? The first rays of sunlight crept through Vince's living room window, finding him already awake in his armchair. He hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the image of that small girl in the cemetery, her quiet voice, her knowing eyes. She'd given him back his sons, and then vanished like smoke. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced down the hallway where his boys slept. They hadn't made a sound all night. The silence in the house felt heavy, unnatural. Children should make noise, he thought. But his weren't children anymore, not the way they used to be. Vince pulled on his leather jacket, the familiar weight settling on his broad shoulders. He scribbled a quick note and left it on the kitchen counter, just in case the boys woke up. Gone out. Back soon. Food in fridge. His handwriting was messy, betraying his trembling hands. The morning air was crisp as he climbed into his truck. The local homeless shelter was his first stop, a brick building with peeling paint and a sign that had seen better days. Inside, the smell of coffee and old clothes hung in the air. A little girl? The shelter manager, an older woman with kind eyes, shook her head. About 6 years old, you say? No, haven't seen anyone that young by themselves. She flipped through a worn logbook. Most children come with their families. A lone girl that age. We'd definitely remember that. Vince's shoulders slumped. He tried the next shelter, and the next. Each time, the same response. No one had seen her. No one knew her name. It was like Sophie had never existed. He drove through downtown, scanning the faces of people on the streets. The city was coming alive, workers hurrying to their jobs, shop owners unlocking their doors. But no sign of a small girl with wise eyes. His phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor checking on the boys. They were still sleeping. Vince felt torn between continuing his search and rushing back home. But he needed to find Sophie. She might know what happened to his sons, might help him understand how to reach them. The truck's engine rumbled as he headed towards the outskirts of town. That's when he spotted it, a collection of tents and makeshift shelters tucked away behind an abandoned warehouse. Blue tarps fluttered in the morning breeze. Clothes hung on lines strung between poles. Hope fluttered in his chest as he pulled over. The camp's residents eyed him warily as he approached. His size and appearance often had that effect on people. A few men stepped protectively in front of their families. "I'm looking for a little girl," Vince said, trying to soften his voice. "About 6 years old. Name's Sophie. She helped me yesterday. She's alone, as far as I know." The residents exchanged glances. An elderly woman approached him, leaning on a cane. "No children here alone, mister. We look out for our own, and we'd never let a little one wander by herself." Vince walked between the tents, hope draining from him with each step. No Sophie, no trace of her. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He should have kept her close yesterday, should have made sure she was safe before focusing on his sons. Now she was out there somewhere, alone, maybe needing help as much as his boys had. He trudged back to his truck, the weight of failure heavy on his shoulders. The mystery of Sophie would have to wait. His sons needed him, and he couldn't let them down. Not again. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Vince stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes. He'd gotten up early, determined to make breakfast special. The familiar sizzle of butter on the griddle filled the quiet house. His son's favorite breakfast. At least it used to be. Ryan and Danny sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, eyes down. They hadn't changed much in the past few days. Ryan hadn't spoken a single word, and Danny only muttered one-word responses when absolutely necessary. Vince placed plates stacked with golden pancakes in front of them, his large hands trembling slightly. "Made them just like you used to like," Vince said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle. "With extra chocolate chips." The boys didn't respond. Danny picked at his food with his fork, while Ryan just stared at his plate. Vince's heart ached as he watched them. These were his boys, his own flesh and blood, but they might as well have been strangers. Throughout the day, Vince tried everything he could think of. He brought out their old toy cars, still carefully preserved in boxes. The twins used to spend hours racing them across the living room floor. Now the cars sat untouched on the coffee table, while the boys huddled together on the couch, as far from Vince as possible. "Remember this one?" Vince held up a red Ferrari, Danny's old favorite. "You used to say it was the fastest car in the world." Danny's eyes flickered to the toy for just a moment before he turned away. Ryan didn't even look up. By afternoon, Vince's patience was wearing thin, not with his sons, but with himself. Every attempt at connection seemed to push them further away. He tried reading their old bedtime stories, showing them pictures from happier times, even offering to play their favorite video games. Nothing worked. When dinner time came around, Vince heated up some soup and made grilled cheese sandwiches. Simple comfort food. The boys sat in their usual spots, the scraping of chairs against the floor the only sound in the room. "It's getting cold out there," Vince said, trying to fill the silence. "Maybe tomorrow we could go get you some warmer clothes?" No response. Danny stared at his soup, his face twisted in a scowl. Without warning, he pushed his plate away, the bowl scraping across the table. Some soup sloshed over the side. "Danny," Vince said, reaching out, instinctively. "You need to eat something, son." The moment Vince's hand moved toward him, Danny jerked back. His chair scraped against the floor as he recoiled, his eyes wide with fear. Ryan immediately grabbed his brother's arm, pulling him closer protectively. The rejection hit Vince like a physical blow. He pulled his hand back slowly, his chest tight with pain. These weren't just strangers. They were his sons, terrified of their own father. The weight of their fear, their distrust, pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. Without another word, Vince stood up from the table. His footsteps echoed through the quiet house as he walked to his bedroom, closing the door behind him. He sat heavily on the edge of his bed, his large frame seeming to collapse in on itself. In the silence of his room, the tough exterior he'd been trying to maintain crumbled away, leaving only the raw pain of a father who couldn't reach his children. The house creaked in the darkness as Vince stirred from his troubled sleep. A faint blue glow flickered down the hallway, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices from the television. He glanced at his bedside clock, 2:17 a.m. Careful not to make any sudden movements, Vince eased himself out of bed. His sock-covered feet moved silently across the wooden floor as he approached the living room. There, huddled together on the worn leather couch, sat Ryan and Danny. The TV cast dancing shadows across their small faces as they watched an old cartoon. Vince's heart clenched. They looked so vulnerable, so young, yet their eyes held a wariness that no child should know. They were watching Tom and Jerry, the volume barely above a whisper. He remembered how they used to laugh at these same cartoons, their giggles filling the house with joy. "Can't sleep?" Vince asked softly, keeping his distance in the doorway. Both boys stiffened at his voice. Danny's hand immediately found Ryan's, their fingers interlocking in a familiar gesture of mutual protection. They didn't answer, but they didn't run either. Vince counted that as progress. Moving with deliberate slowness, Vince settled into the armchair furthest from the couch. He kept his movements predictable, non-threatening, like approaching scared animals. The cartoon played on, filling the awkward silence with gentle background noise. "I used to watch this with my dad," Vince said quietly, his eyes on the screen. "He'd make us hot chocolate on nights when we couldn't sleep." He paused, memories washing over him. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" Danny's eyes flickered toward him for a brief moment before returning to the TV. Ryan remained completely still, but Vince noticed his shoulders relax slightly at the mention of hot chocolate. They used to drink it together on cold winter mornings, back when the world made sense. "I'll make some," Vince said, rising slowly. "You don't have to drink it if you don't want to." In the kitchen, Vince's hands shook as he prepared 3 mugs. He added extra marshmallows to the boys' cups, just like he used to. The familiar motions brought back memories of happier times, weekend mornings, snow days, quiet evenings together. When he returned, he placed their mugs on the coffee table, well within reach but not too close. He settled back into his chair with his own drink, letting the warmth seep into his palms. Minutes ticked by. On the screen, Tom chased Jerry through another elaborate scheme. Danny was the first to move, reaching cautiously for his mug. He took a small sip, then another. Ryan watched his brother carefully before following suit. They sat in shared silence, the tension gradually easing as the cartoon played on. Vince noticed Ryan's eyes occasionally drifting in his direction, quick glances when he thought Vince wasn't looking. Finally, during a commercial break, Ryan shifted slightly on the couch. His mouth opened, then closed, as if wrestling with something inside himself. Vince waited, hardly daring to breathe. "Daddy?" Ryan whispered, his voice rough from disuse, barely audible over the TV's soft murmur. The single word hung in the air between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Vince's heart swelled with a sudden rush of hope so intense it brought tears to his eyes. He gripped his mug tighter, forcing himself to stay still, to not frighten this precious moment away. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, as Vince flipped pancakes on the griddle. It had been 3 days since that late-night moment with the boys, and though progress was slow, tiny changes were becoming visible. Ryan had spoken a few more words, and Danny had started making eye contact during meals. "Breakfast's almost ready," Vince called out softly, not wanting to startle them. The boys sat at the kitchen table, their shoulders hunched but not as tense as before. The smell of butter and maple syrup filled the air, a comforting reminder of normal family life. A sharp knock at the door made all 3 of them jump. The boys immediately drew closer together, their eyes wide with fear. Vince's heart ached at their reaction. "It's okay," he assured them, keeping his voice steady. "Stay here. I'll check who it is." At the door stood a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a neat blazer and slacks. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her expression was both professional and kind. "Mr. McAllister?" she asked, pulling out a badge. "I'm Detective Laura Miller from the Missing Persons Unit. May I come in?" Vince glanced back toward the kitchen, worried about his sons. "Now's not really a good time," he said, his voice low. "I understand," Detective Miller replied, matching his quiet tone. "But we have new information about your son's case, information that might help us find the people responsible." Vince hesitated, then nodded. "Let me check on my boys first." He returned to the kitchen, where Ryan and Danny sat frozen in their chairs. "Hey, guys, there's a police officer here who wants to talk to me. Would you be okay going up to your room for a little while?" The boys scurried upstairs without a word, and Vince's chest tightened at their fear. He invited Detective Miller into the living room, keeping his movements careful and deliberate. "I appreciate you seeing me," Miller began, settling into an armchair. "We've been investigating your son's case, and some new evidence has come to light." She pulled out a notepad. "Can you tell me about the day they disappeared?" Vince ran a hand through his beard, the memories still raw. "They were playing in the front yard. I went inside for maybe 5 minutes to answer the phone. When I came back..." His voice caught. "They were gone." Detective Miller nodded sympathetically. "And what about the day you found them? You mentioned a young girl?" "Sophie," Vince confirmed. "She just appeared at the cemetery, told me where to find them, then vanished. Did she say anything else? Anything about where the boys had been?" Vince shook his head. "No, she just pointed me to that dumpster and disappeared." Miller's expression grew serious. "Mr. McAllister, we believe your son's abduction might be connected to a larger case we've been tracking." She leaned forward slightly. "There's evidence suggesting an organized trafficking ring operating in the area. The pattern matches several other cases we've investigated." The words hit Vince like a physical blow. His hands clenched into fists as he processed what she was saying. "A trafficking ring?" he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Miller confirmed. "And finding your sons, and possibly this girl Sophie, could be the break we've been looking for. Would you be willing to work with us? Help us put these people away?" Vince thought of his boys upstairs, of their fear and trauma. He thought of Sophie, alone somewhere in the city, his jaw set with determination. "Whatever you need," he said firmly. "I'll help." Vince's motorcycle rumbled down Main Street, with Detective Miller following in her unmarked police car. They'd been visiting local businesses for hours, showing pictures of the boys and Sophie, hoping someone might recognize them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they pulled up to Joe's Diner, their 5th stop of the day. The neon "Open" sign buzzed quietly in the window. Inside, the smell of coffee and grilled onions filled the air. "I've been here 20 years, said Joe, the owner, squinting at the photos through thick glasses. Never seen these boys before." He paused at Sophie's picture, his weathered face creasing with concentration. "But this little girl, yeah, she'd come in sometimes. Always alone." Vince's heart jumped. "When? What did she do?" Joe wiped his hands on his apron. "She'd sit in that corner booth over there, sometimes just to get warm. If we weren't busy, I'd give her some soup or hot chocolate." He shook his head sadly. "Strange kid. Seemed older than she looked, you know what I mean?" Detective Miller pulled out her notebook. "Did she ever mention where she was staying? Or talk about any other children?" "Nah, didn't talk much at all, but—" Joe hesitated. "There was this one time, she was drawing on a napkin, pictures of other kids. When I asked about them, she got real quiet and left. Never saw those drawings again." They thanked Joe and headed to their next stop, a homeless shelter 3 blocks away. The facility was clean, but worn, with peeling paint and mismatched furniture in the lobby. "Sophie would show up every few weeks," said Maria, the shelter coordinator. "We tried to convince her to stay, but she'd always leave before social services arrived." She looked at Miller. "We filed reports, of course." "Did she ever mention other children?" Miller asked, her voice gentle but firm. Maria's expression darkened. "Once, she was having a nightmare during a nap. Kept mumbling about the others and the bad place. When she woke up, she was terrified." She wrung her hands. "I should have done more." Outside, Miller turned to Vince. "Based on these accounts, we believe Sophie might have been more than just a random homeless girl. She could have been witnessing the trafficking operation firsthand." Vince leaned against his motorcycle, feeling sick. "You think she was one of their victims?" "Possibly, but she might have escaped, which would explain why she knew where to find your sons." Miller's face was grim. "The fact that she kept avoiding social services, her knowledge of other children, it fits the pattern we've seen in similar cases." The weight of this revelation settled heavy in Vince's chest. He remembered Sophie's knowing eyes, her quiet confidence despite her ragged appearance. Had she been an angel of mercy, leading him to his sons? Or was she just another lost child, trying to help others escape the nightmare she'd endured? The drive home was a blur. Vince's mind raced with images of Sophie alone on the streets, running from whatever horrors she'd witnessed. The thought of her being caught up in something so evil made his stomach turn. Pulling into his driveway, Vince saw his sons' shadows in their bedroom window. They were safe now, thanks to Sophie. But where was she? What dangers might she be facing? He sat in his parked car for a long moment, wrestling with the question that had haunted him since that day in the cemetery. Was Sophie a divine messenger sent to reunite his family, or just a brave little girl fighting against monsters that no child should ever have to face? The morning sun filtered through the leaves as Vince watched his sons from a park bench. The playground was alive with the sounds of laughing children, but Ryan and Danny stood apart, huddled together near the swing set. They hadn't moved from that spot for 15 minutes. Vince's heart ached. Other kids their age were climbing, sliding, and playing tag, but his boys seemed frozen, in place. Danny's fingers were wrapped tightly around Ryan's sleeve, his knuckles white with tension. Ryan's eyes darted back and forth, scanning for invisible threats. "Hey boys," Vince called softly, walking over to them. "Would you like to try the swings?" Danny shook his head quickly, while Ryan just stared at the ground. Vince knelt down to their level, trying to make himself less intimidating despite his large frame. "How about we start with something smaller?" he suggested. He pulled a small rubber ball from his jacket pocket. "We could just toss this around, right here where it's quiet." The twins exchanged glances, their silent communication a reminder of all they'd been through together. Finally, Danny gave a tiny nod. They formed a small triangle, just a few feet apart. Vince gently tossed the ball to Ryan, who caught it reflexively but held it like it might break. When he finally threw it to Danny, his movement was stiff and uncertain. The game lasted barely 5 minutes before Danny dropped the ball and walked away, his shoulders tense. Ryan followed immediately, like a shadow. Vince tried again the next day with a trip to the ice cream shop. The boys sat rigid in their chairs, barely touching their sundaes. When another customer dropped a spoon, both twins jumped so violently their ice cream bowls rattled. The third day, Vince brought them to the library, thinking the quiet atmosphere might help. But the enclosed space seemed to make them more anxious. Danny kept looking at the exit, while Ryan pressed himself into a corner, clutching a picture book like a shield. It was in the car ride home that everything fell apart. A truck backfired nearby, and Danny started screaming. Ryan covered his ears and rocked back and forth in his seat. Vince pulled over immediately, his heart racing. Once home, after Danny had worn himself out crying and gone to lie down, Vince found Ryan sitting alone in the living room. The boy's face was pale, his hands trembling, slightly. Vince sat down next to him, leaving enough space so Ryan wouldn't feel trapped. "It's okay to feel scared," he said softly. "What happened to you? No child should ever have to go through that." Ryan's breathing hitched. For a moment, Vince thought he would retreat into silence again. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ryan began to speak. "They kept us in a dark place," he said, his words coming out in short bursts. "Underground, I think. There were other kids too." He wrapped his arms around himself. "They take kids away sometimes. We never saw them again." Tears rolled down Ryan's cheeks. "Danny and me, we promised to stay together. We didn't want to disappear too." His voice cracked. "When they brought food, we had to fight for it. If we made noise, they'd—" He stopped, his whole body shaking. "The loud sounds," Ryan continued after a moment, "they remind me of when they'd slam the doors, and when we'd hear screaming." His fingers dug into his arms. "I don't want to go back there, Dad. Please don't let them take us again." Vince's phone buzzed on his nightstand, jolting him awake. The clock read 3:17 a.m. An unknown number had sent him a text message. "The girl you seek walks among shadows. Factory Row. Building 23. The truth lies in the basement." He sat up, his heart pounding. Factory Row was an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of town. His years with the Hells Angels had taught him about places like that. Perfect spots for things that needed to stay hidden. After checking on the twins, who were finally sleeping through the night, Vince grabbed his leather jacket and truck keys. The streets were empty as he drove through the sleeping town, his headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Factory Row loomed ahead, a collection of decrepit buildings with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Building 23 stood at the far end, partially hidden behind overgrown weeds. The structure's metal walls were rusted, and chains hung loose from the main entrance. Vince parked his truck behind some bushes and approached on foot. The smell of mold and decay grew stronger as he got closer. Using his phone's flashlight, he examined the chains. They weren't actually locked, just wrapped around the handles to look secure. Inside, his boots crunched on broken glass and debris. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. But something else caught his attention. Recent footprints in the dust, small ones that could belong to children. "Sophie?" he whispered, though he knew she wouldn't answer. His voice echoed through the empty space. The beam of his flashlight revealed old machinery, covered in cobwebs and rust. But as he moved deeper into the building, he noticed other things. Discarded food wrappers, recent ones. A small blanket wadded up in a corner. A child's shoe. The basement door was heavy steel, unlike the other rotting doors in the building. It had a new padlock, incongruous against the aging metal. Vince's stomach churned as he examined the area around it. Scratch marks marred the concrete floor, as if something, or someone, had been dragged. Behind some crates, he found a notebook. The pages were filled with numbers, dates, and initials. Some entries had dollar amounts next to them. The last page had today's date, and the letters ST followed by a large sum. Vince's hands shook as he photographed each page with his phone. In the corner of the basement door, partially hidden behind a rusty pipe, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A small bracelet made of colored threads. He recognized it immediately. Sophie had been wearing it the day she led him to his sons. Moving his flashlight across the walls, he discovered more evidence. Chains bolted at regular intervals, a camera mount in the corner, and what looked like dried bloodstains on the concrete. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a prison. The sound of a car, engine outside, snapped him to attention. Quickly he pocketed the notebook and Sophie's bracelet, then slipped behind a large piece of machinery. Headlights swept across the building's interior through the broken windows. Vince held his breath, waiting until the vehicle passed. When he was sure it was gone, he made his way back to the entrance, his mind racing with what he'd discovered. This place wasn't just connected to Sophie. It was part of something much bigger and much darker. As he drove home, the notebook felt heavy in his pocket. He knew he should take this to Detective Miller, but first he needed to process what he'd found. The pieces were starting to fit together. Sophie, his sons, this warehouse. The truth was ugly, but at least now he had something concrete to go on. Vince's phone rang as he was making breakfast for the boys. Detective Miller's name flashed on the screen. His stomach tightened. She never called this early unless something was wrong. "Sophie's gone," Detective Miller said, her voice tense. "The shelter workers said she was there last night, but this morning her bed was empty. No one saw her leave." Vince gripped the counter, his knuckles turning white. The pancake on the stove began to smoke. Forgotten. "What do you mean, gone? She was supposed to be safe there." "We're doing everything we can," Miller replied, frustration clear in her voice. "But it's like she vanished into thin air. Again. No security cameras caught her leaving, no witnesses, nothing." Vince switched off the stove and stepped away from the kitchen, lowering his voice so the boys wouldn't hear. "This isn't just some runaway case, Detective. You saw what I found at that warehouse. She's in danger." "I know, Vince. Trust me, I know. We've got officers canvassing the area, but—" She paused. "Look, maybe you could help. You found her once before. Maybe you can do it again." After hanging up, Vince called his neighbor Mrs. Thompson to watch the boys. He couldn't sit still while Sophie was out there somewhere, possibly in the hands of those monsters. The morning turned into afternoon as Vince searched every street and alley he could think of. He checked the cemetery where he'd first met her, the dumpster where she'd led him to his sons, and even returned to the warehouse, but found nothing. Each empty location felt like a punch to his gut. The sun was setting when he finally turned his truck toward home. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel too tight, and his throat felt raw from calling Sophie's name into empty spaces. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. Anger bubbled up inside him. Anger at the traffickers who'd hurt so many children. Anger at himself for not protecting Sophie better. Anger at a world that let these things happen. He slammed his palm against the dashboard, the sharp pain barely registering through his frustration. When he pulled into his driveway, Mrs. Thompson met him at the door. "The boys have been quiet all day," she said softly. "They've barely left their room." Vince thanked her and headed upstairs. He found Ryan and Danny sitting on their beds, both clutching the stuffed animals he'd bought them last week. They looked up at him with those haunted eyes that broke his heart every time. Without saying a word, Vince sat between their beds and opened his arms. For a moment, neither boy moved. Then Danny slid off his bed and curled up against Vince's side. Ryan followed a few seconds later, pressing his face into Vince's shirt. "I promise you both," Vince whispered, holding them close. "Everything will be okay." His voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. "We're going to find Sophie, and we're going to make sure no one ever hurts any of you again." The boys didn't respond, but they held on tighter. And for now, that was enough. The evening shadows stretched across the boys' bedroom as Vince held his sons close. Their small bodies trembled against him, and he could feel their fear, the same fear that had haunted them since their return. The stuffed animals lay forgotten on the floor, knocked aside when the boys had rushed into his embrace. "Listen to me, both of you," Vince said softly, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled back just enough to look at their faces. Danny's eyes were red from crying, while Ryan stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched. "I need you to know something very important." He gently lifted Ryan's chin with his finger until both boys were looking at him. The resemblance between them still caught his breath sometimes, the same brown eyes, the same curved eyebrows. But now those eyes held shadows no child should know. "I made a mistake before," Vince continued, his throat tight. "I wasn't there when you needed me most. But that will never happen again." He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "I promise you both, I will never leave you again. Never." Danny's lower lip trembled. "What if the bad people come back?" The question hit Vince like a physical blow. He pulled them closer, his massive arms forming a protective circle around their small frames. "Then they'll have to go through me first, and trust me, boys, nobody gets past your old man." He tried to inject some lightness into his voice, but the fierce protectiveness in his words was unmistakable. Ryan pressed his face against Vince's chest, his words muffled but clear enough to break Vince's heart. "You promise?" "I promise." Vince's voice was firm, unwavering. "From now on, wherever you go, I go. Whatever happens, we face it together. You're my boys, and nothing will ever change that." The room grew quieter as the boys gradually relaxed in their father's embrace. Vince could feel some of the tension leaving their small bodies, could sense them starting to believe in his words. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "And Sophie?" Danny asked suddenly, his voice small but hopeful. "Will you protect her too?" Vince swallowed hard. "Yes, buddy, Sophie too, as soon as we find her." A sharp knock at the front door cut through the quiet moment. The boys instantly tensed, and Vince held them tighter. "It's okay," he assured them. "Stay here. I'll check who it is." He untangled himself from his sons and moved quickly downstairs. Through the window he could see Detective Miller's familiar figure on his porch, her expression urgent even in the dim light. Vince yanked open the door. "Detective?" "We found her," Miller said without preamble, her face grave. "Sophie. She's alive, but—" She hesitated, which was unlike her. "Vince, it's not good. She's at Memorial Hospital in critical condition. They're not sure if—" Vince was already reaching for his keys. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, knowing his elderly neighbor would hear him through her open window next door. "Can you—" "Go," came her immediate response as she appeared at his door. "I'll watch the boys. Just go." Vince rushed back upstairs, his heart pounding. The boys stood in their doorway, faces pale with worry. "I have to go check on Sophie," he explained quickly, kneeling before them. But Mrs. Thompson will be right here with you, and I'll be back as soon as I can. Remember what I just promised you?" "That you'll never leave us," Ryan whispered. "That's right. This isn't me leaving. This is me keeping my other promise, to protect Sophie too." He hugged them both quickly, then followed Detective Miller to her car. The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across Sophie's small face. Vince sat in an oversized chair that creaked under his weight, his large frame making the hospital furniture seem even more fragile. The steady beeping of monitors filled the sterile room, marking each precious heartbeat. Sophie looked impossibly tiny in the hospital bed, wrapped in white sheets that only emphasized her pallor. Purple bruises bloomed across her exposed arms, and a nasty cut ran along her hairline. Various tubes and wires connected her to machines that Vince couldn't begin to understand. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one seeming to take more effort than the last. Detective Miller stood in the doorway, her normally composed face showing signs of distress. "The doctors say she's stable, but weak. They found evidence of—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Long-term abuse." Vince's hands clenched into fists. The anger that had defined his life as a Hell's Angel threatened to surface, but he forced it down. Anger wouldn't help Sophie now. "Hey, little one," he whispered, his voice gentler than anyone who knew him would believe possible. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." Sophie's eyelids fluttered, and she turned her head slightly toward his voice. Her eyes opened halfway, clouded with pain and medication. "Mr. McAllister?" Her voice was barely audible, scratchy and dry. "I'm here." He leaned forward, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. "You don't have to talk if it hurts." But Sophie's small hand reached out, searching. Vince wrapped his massive palm around her tiny fingers, providing an anchor. Had to tell you," she mumbled, fighting to keep her eyes open. "Shh, save your strength," Vince soothed, but Sophie shook her head weakly. "No, listen." Her words came out in short bursts between labored breaths. "The men who took Ryan and Danny, I knew them." Detective Miller stepped closer, pulling out her notepad, but stayed quiet. They take kids," Sophie continued, her voice trembling. "Lots of kids. I saw them bring new ones while I was there." A tear rolled down her cheek. "Your boys, they were so scared." Vince's throat tightened. He squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "I tried to protect them." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Gave them my food when they were hungry. Told them stories at night." She paused, struggling for breath. "The men, they didn't watch me? As careful? Thought I was too weak." "You helped them escape?" Vince asked softly. Sophie nodded slightly. "Found a way, through the fence, but—" Her voice grew more urgent, though weaker. "They're angry now. The men, they know I helped." Her eyes widened with fear, and the monitors showed her heart rate increasing. "They'll come for you next." Her eyes rolled back, and her small hand went limp in Vince's grip. The monitors started beeping more rapidly as Sophie lost consciousness. "Sophie! Sophie!" Vince called out, but nurses were already rushing in, pushing him aside to tend to their young patient. Detective Miller grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "Let them work," she said firmly. "She needs medical attention now." Vince stood in the hallway, watching through the window as the medical team worked to stabilize Sophie, her warning echoing in his mind. The intensive care unit was eerily quiet, except for the steady hum of machines. Vince paced the hallway, his heavy boots making muffled sounds on the polished floor. Every few minutes, He'd glance through the window at Sophie's still form, watching her chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, aided by a ventilator. Detective Miller sat in a plastic chair, files spread across her lap. "The description Sophie gave matches our intelligence on several trafficking operations," she said, shuffling through papers. "But these people are like ghosts. They never stay in one place long enough to leave a trail." Vince stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, running a hand through his beard. "She mentioned a fence, some kind of compound?" "That narrows it down." Miller pulled out a map marked with red circles. "We've identified 3 possible locations on the outskirts of town that fit that description, all abandoned industrial sites." A nurse emerged from Sophie's room, her face tight with concern. "Her fever's getting worse," she reported. "We're doing everything we can, but her body's been through severe trauma." Vince's shoulders slumped. He felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him, for his boys, for Sophie, for all the other children still trapped in this nightmare. "The warehouse on Marlowe Street," he said suddenly, turning to Miller. "When I was with the Angels, we heard rumors about activity there. Strange vehicles coming and going at odd hours." Miller's eyes lit up. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Back then, it wasn't my business to ask questions." Shame colored his voice. "But now—" They spent the next hour reviewing satellite images and property records. The warehouse complex was massive, with multiple buildings and high-security fencing, exactly as Sophie had described. "Look at these power readings," Miller pointed to a graph. "They're using way too much electricity for an abandoned building, and these delivery manifests, food supplies that could feed dozens." Vince studied the security camera footage. Miller had pulled up on her laptop. "There," he pointed to a grainy figure. "That man in the background. I recognize him from Sophie's description, the one with the limp." Miller immediately called for backup. Within minutes, the hospital hallway filled with plainclothes officers, reviewing tactical plans and coordinating with SWAT teams. "We move in an hour," Miller announced, strapping on her vest. "Vince, I need you to stay here. You're too close to this, and we need someone watching over Sophie." Vince wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. His size and reputation might have been useful in a fight, but this needed to be done by the book. No mistakes, no loose ends. He watched through the window as Sophie fought her fever, her small face flushed and sweating. A doctor adjusted her medication, checking vital signs with a worried expression. The raid team moved out, leaving Vince alone with his thoughts and the beeping monitors. Hours crawled by with no word. Sophie's condition continued to deteriorate, her temperature climbing despite the medical team's best efforts. Finally, Miller returned, her face grim and her clothes dusty. "We got some of them," she reported. "But the main players were gone. They must have had inside information. The place was mostly cleared out." "What did you find?" Vince asked, his voice hoarse. "Evidence of at least 12 children being held there recently. Documents, photographs." She shook her head. "But the operation itself has moved. We've wounded them, but they're still out there." Vince looked through the window at Sophie, so small and vulnerable in her hospital bed. They'd failed her. Failed all of them. The monsters who did this were still free, still hurting children, and he felt powerless to stop them. Vince's truck rumbled down the empty streets, streetlights casting long shadows across his weathered face. The events at the hospital played over and over in his mind. Sophie's fever, the failed raid, the criminals slipping away like smoke. His massive hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light cast a weak glow across the front yard. Through the window, he could see Ryan and Danny sitting on the couch, their faces illuminated by the TV screen. Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor who'd agreed to watch them, dozed in the armchair. Inside, the boys looked up at him with questioning eyes. They'd grown more comfortable around him these past weeks, but there was still a barrier there, invisible but solid as steel. "How's Sophie?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vince settled heavily onto the couch between them. She's sick, buddy. The doctors are doing everything they can." Ryan pressed against his side, something he'd only recently started doing. The contact made Vince's heart ache. After thanking and paying Mrs. Henderson, he tried to focus on normal things, getting the boys ready for bed, checking their homework, making sure they brushed their teeth. But their eyes followed him everywhere, full of unasked questions. They knew something was wrong. Of course they did. They'd lived through horrors he could barely imagine. The thought made his stomach turn. In the kitchen, washing dishes, he heard them whispering to each other. He couldn't make out the words, but the fear in their tone was clear. When he looked over his shoulder, they quickly pretended to be watching TV again. "Hey," he said, drying his hands. "Come here, both of you." They approached cautiously, like wild animals unsure of a potential threat. It broke his heart how they still sometimes acted around him, their own father. "I know you're scared," he said, kneeling down to their level. "I am too, but I promise you nothing bad is going to happen to you again, not ever." Danny's lower lip trembled. "But what about Sophie?" Vince pulled them both into a gentle hug. "We're going to help her. The police are working hard to catch the bad people." "Like the ones who took us?" Ryan's voice cracked. The question hit Vince like a physical blow. "Yeah, buddy. Like them." After putting them to bed, Vince found himself driving to the cemetery. The headstones cast long shadows in the moonlight, and his boots crunched on the frost-covered grass. He'd visited this spot so many times over the past 2 years, mourning sons he thought were dead. Now they were home, alive but changed, damaged, and he felt just as helpless as he had when they were missing. Standing before the empty grave, they'd never found bodies to bury. Vince felt the weight of his failure crushing down on him. He'd failed to protect them before, failed to find them himself, failed to help Sophie stop the people who'd hurt them. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the cold stone. "I'm so damn sorry." The wind rustled through the bare trees, carrying the promise of winter. Vince touched the headstone, tracing the letters of his sons' names, with rough fingers. "I won't fail you again," he promised, his voice hoarse with emotion. The words seemed to hang in the cold night air, a vow made to both the living and the dead. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the stark white room. Vince sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his large frame making it seem comically small. His weathered hands were clasped together, elbows resting on his knees as he watched Sophie's small form in the hospital bed. A slight movement caught his eye. Sophie's fingers twitched, and her eyelids fluttered open. She blinked several times, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lights above. "Hey there, kiddo," Vince said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle despite his imposing appearance. "You gave us quite a scare." Sophie's eyes darted around the room before settling on him. "The boys?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "They're safe. Mrs. Henderson is watching them." Vince poured her a cup of water, helping her take small sips through a straw. "How are you feeling?" "Tired." Sophie's small hand gripped the thin hospital blanket. "They found me, Mr. McAllister. I thought I was smart enough to hide, but they found me anyway." Vince leaned forward, his heart heavy. "Who found you, Sophie?" She shook her head, fear flickering across her face. "Bad people. Worse than I thought. They're everywhere. Police stations, schools, stores." Her voice trembled. I tried to help other kids like Ryan and Danny, but there's so many of them. Detective Miller entered the room quietly, notepad in hand. She pulled up another chair, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. Sophie, I know you're scared, but we need to know what you saw. Sophie's grip on the blanket tightened. You don't understand. These aren't just regular criminals. They have fancy cars and nice houses. They look normal on the outside. Tears welled up in her eyes. I heard them talking about their boss, someone they called the principal. They said no one ever sees him, but he sees everything. Vince exchanged a look with Detective Miller. This was bigger than they'd imagined. Sophie, Miller said gently, can you tell us about the warehouse? The one where they kept you? There's more than one, Sophie replied. They move kids around a lot, but I remember... She closed her eyes, concentrating. I remember seeing letters on papers. BTE Industries. They used those trucks to move us. Miller scribbled in her notebook, while Vince's fists clenched. He'd seen those trucks around town. They were everywhere, hiding in plain sight. You're very brave, Sophie, Vince said, carefully placing his large hand over her small one. I promise you, you're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes far too old for her young face. But they'll try. They always try. That's why I ran away so many times. That's why I couldn't stay after I showed you where Ryan and Danny were. Miller stood up, her expression determined. I need to make some calls. We'll put a protective detail on this room. She paused at the door. Vince, can I talk to you outside for a minute? In the hallway, Miller showed him her notes. BTE Industries is owned by Bernard Thomas Edwards. He's a prominent businessman, donates to children's charities, sits on the school board. Her voice dropped lower. And he matches several witness descriptions of the principal. Vince felt his jaw tighten. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed made his blood run cold. This wasn't just about finding justice anymore. These people knew where he lived, knew about his sons. They could be watching right now. What's our next move? He asked, glancing back at Sophie's room. We follow the money, Miller replied. Every operation this big leaves a trail. We just need to find it. Vince's phone buzzed in his pocket as he sat in Sophie's hospital room. Detective Miller's name flashed on the screen. He stepped into the hallway, careful not to wake the sleeping girl. What have you got? He asked quietly. You better sit down for this, Vince. Miller's voice was grim. We traced some payments from BTE Industries. They were going to someone you know, Jake Morrison. Vince's legs felt weak. He leaned against the wall, his mind reeling. Jake had been more than just another member of the Angels. They'd ridden together for 15 years, shared beers, watched each other's backs in countless fights. Jake had even been at his son's christening. That's impossible, Vince muttered, but even as he said it, memories started clicking into place. Jake's mysterious disappearances, the new car, the sudden cash flow he'd claimed came from investments. The payments go back 2 years, Miller continued, right around the time your boys disappeared. Vince's free hand clenched into a fist. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, making his stomach churn. Where is he? We tracked him to the Rusty Nail. Our team is getting ready to move, but... Vince hung up. He knew where Jake would be. Not in the bar itself, but in the private room upstairs where they used to play poker. His feet carried him down the hospital corridor on autopilot. A nurse called out something about visiting hours, but he barely heard her. The drive to the Rusty Nail passed in a blur of rage and hurt. The neon sign buzzed overhead as Vince parked his truck. Inside, the familiar smell of stale beer and cigarettes hit him. A few old-timers looked up, then quickly looked away. His reputation still carried weight here. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heavy boots thundering on the wooden steps. The door to the private room was closed, but light spilled out underneath. Vince didn't knock. Jake sat at the old poker table, counting stacks of bills. He looked up, startled, then relaxed when he saw who it was. "Vince, brother, it's been too long." Vince crossed the room in 3 strides and slammed both hands on the table, scattering money across the floor. 2 years, Jake. 2 years my boys were gone." Jake's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "BTE Industries, the payments, the trafficking." Each word felt like acid in Vince's mouth. "My sons, Jake. My sons." The color drained from Jake's face. He pushed his chair back, hands raised. "Listen, Vince, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Vince roared. "Tell me you didn't know where they were. Tell me you didn't help hide them." Jake's eyes darted to the door, but Vince blocked his path. "It was just supposed to be business," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I didn't know they were taking your boys, I swear. By the time I found out, it was too late." "Too late?" Vince grabbed Jake's shirt, lifting him halfway out of his chair. "You were my brother." "The money was too good." Jake's words tumbled out in panic. "Edwards, he has connections everywhere. Police, judges, business owners. Once you're in, you can't get out. He knows everything about everyone." "Where is he?" Vince growled. "The old Carson steel plant," Jake whispered. "That's where they process the paperwork, move the kids through. Please, Vince, you can't tell them I told you. He'll—" The door burst open. Detective Miller stood there with 2 officers, weapons drawn. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest." As the officers cuffed Jake, Miller turned to Vince. "We got it all on tape, his confession, the location, everything." Vince watched as they led Jake away, the betrayal still burning in his chest. His old friend wouldn't meet his eyes as he passed. The old Carson steel plant loomed against the darkening sky, its rusted walls a testament to decades of abandonment. Vince crouched behind a patrol car, his heart hammering against his ribs. Detective Miller stood beside him, speaking quietly into her radio. "All units in position," she confirmed. "Remember, we need them alive. They have information about other operations." Vince nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to burst through those doors and unleash years of pent-up rage. He thought of his sons, safe at home with a police guard. He thought of Sophie in her hospital bed. For them, he needed to stay focused. "Ready?" Miller asked, checking her weapon. "Let's finish this," Vince growled. The SWAT team moved first, their boots crunching on broken glass and gravel. Vince followed close behind Miller, his massive frame surprisingly quiet for such a big man. The factory's main entrance groaned as they breached it. Inside, darkness pressed in around them. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom, illuminating ancient machinery and conveyor belts. Their footsteps echoed off the high ceiling. The air smelled of rust and mold. A crash from above sent everyone's weapons pointing upward. "Movement on the catwalk," someone whispered. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the darkness. Bullets pinged off metal surfaces, sending sparks flying. Vince ducked behind a massive gear assembly, his ears ringing from the noise. "Police! Drop your weapons!" Miller's voice boomed through the chaos. More shots answered her command. Vince peered around his cover, spotting movement near the old office area. 2 figures were trying to slip away through a side door. "Miller," he called out, pointing. She nodded, and they moved together, staying low. The chase led them through a maze of corridors. Papers littered the floor. Documents, fake passports, evidence of lives bought and sold. Vince's stomach turned at the sight. They cornered the runners in what looked like a processing room. Desks were arranged in rows, computers still humming. One of the men Vince recognized from Jake's description, Edwards, the ringleader. "It's over," Miller announced, her weapon trained on Edwards. "On your knees, hands where we can see them." Edwards, a well-dressed man in his 50s, smiled coldly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, slowly raising his hands. "This goes deeper than you can imagine." "Shut up," Vince snarled, taking a threatening step forward. "You took my boys." "Ah, the McAllister twins," Edwards nodded, as if remembering a minor business transaction. "They were quite valuable, you know. Pure-blooded American children fetch a high price." Vince lunged forward, but Miller caught his arm. "Don't," she warned. "He's not worth it." Other officers flooded the room, securing the suspects. As they led Edwards away in handcuffs, he called over his shoulder, "That little girl of yours, Sophie, she was one of our best finds. Such a shame she turned on us." Vince's fists clenched, but he held himself back. He watched as the police gathered evidence, photographing documents and bagging computers. Their victory felt hollow somehow. These men would face justice, but the damage they'd done couldn't be undone. Looking around the room, Vince saw dozens of photographs pinned to a bulletin board. Children's faces stared back at him. Some missing. Some already sold. His boys had been among them. Sophie, too. How many others were still out there? He pulled out his phone, checking for updates from the hospital. Sophie's condition remained unchanged. Despite everything they'd accomplished tonight, Vince couldn't shake the weight in his chest. He'd gotten his justice, but at what price? How many lives had been shattered before they'd finally stopped these monsters? The porch light cast a warm glow as Vince climbed the steps to his home. His muscles ached from the night's events, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Officer Jenkins stood guard by the front door, nodding as Vince approached. "Everything quiet here?" Vince asked. "Yes, sir. The boys are inside with Officer Martinez. They've been asking about you." Vince pushed open the door, and the familiar creak brought both his sons' heads turning toward him. They sat on the couch, a half-finished puzzle spread on the coffee table before them. Danny clutched, his favorite blanket, while Ryan held tight to the stuffed lion Vince had bought him last week. "Dad," Danny called out, his voice stronger than it had been in days. The sight of his son reaching for him made Vince's throat tight with emotion. Officer Martinez stood up from her chair. "They've been very brave," she said quietly. Vince crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt before his boys. Their faces showed worry, but also trust, something that had taken weeks to rebuild. He reached out, touching each of their cheeks gently. "It's over," he said softly. "The bad people who hurt you, they can't hurt anyone anymore." Ryan's lower lip trembled. "Really? Really?" Vince pulled them both into his arms, feeling their small bodies relax against him. "You know what? You two are heroes, because you were brave enough to tell us what happened. Other kids are going to be safe too." Danny looked up at him, his eyes wide. "What about Sophie? Is she okay?" "Sophie's getting better. Every day," Vince assured them. "The doctors say she might even come home soon." He didn't mention that he'd already started the adoption paperwork. That news could wait for another day. The officers quietly excused themselves, leaving the family alone. Vince sat between his sons on the couch, an arm around each of them. The puzzle on the table showed a scene of a sunny beach, something Danny had picked out himself at the store. "I'm hungry," Ryan announced after a while, his voice small but steady. Vince checked his watch. It was well past their usual dinner time. How about we make something special tonight? To celebrate? Can we have pancakes? Danny asked hopefully. It was the first time he'd expressed interest in food without prompting. Pancakes for dinner? Vince pretended to consider it seriously, then broke into a smile. I think that's a perfect idea. In the kitchen, Vince mixed the batter while the boys sat at the counter, taking turns adding chocolate chips. The familiar motions of cooking, the sound of his son's quiet chatter, the warmth of the kitchen. It all felt right in a way nothing had for years. He poured the batter onto the griddle, watching as small bubbles formed on the surface. Danny leaned forward, fascinated by the process. Ryan had already set the table, 3 plates, 3 glasses, everything in its place. When the pancakes were ready, golden brown and steaming, they sat down together. The kitchen light cast a cozy glow over the scene. Ryan reached for the syrup without hesitation, another small victory. Danny cut his pancakes into careful squares, just like he used to do before everything happened. Vince watched his sons eat, saw the contentment on their faces, and felt pride swell in his chest. These weren't the same broken boys he'd found in that dumpster. They were healing, growing stronger every day. His family was whole again, and this time, he would never let anything tear them apart. The hospital room was no longer the stark, cold space it had been weeks ago. Colorful drawings from Ryan and Danny covered the walls, and a small teddy bear sat on Sophie's bedside table. Vince settled into the chair next to her bed, his large frame making the plastic hospital chair seem tiny. Sophie looked better today. Her face had more color, and the bruises were finally fading. She sat propped up against her pillows, carefully coloring in a picture book the boys had brought her. How are you feeling, kiddo? Vince asked, his gruff voice gentle. Sophie looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. The doctor said I can try walking today. That's great news. Vince leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Want me to help? She nodded, pushing aside her blanket. Her legs were thin, but stronger than they had been. The physical therapist had been working with her daily, helping her regain her strength. Vince stood and offered his arm. Sophie grabbed it, her small hand disappearing in his large one. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Take it slow, he reminded her. No rush. Sophie's feet touched the cold floor, and she wobbled slightly. Vince steadied her, patient and careful. She took one step, then another, her grip on his hand tight. You're doing great, he encouraged. A small smile spread across her face, the first real one he'd seen since she'd been admitted. It transformed her entire face, making her look like the child she was meant to be, not the scared little girl they'd found. Ryan and Danny are coming later, Vince said as they made their way to the window. They made you something at school. Sophie's eyes lit up. Really? Yep, they've been working on it all week. They reached the window, and Sophie pressed her free hand against the glass, looking out at the world below. The hospital garden was visible from here, full of bright flowers and winding paths. Can we go down there someday? She asked. As soon as you're strong enough, Vince promised. Maybe next week, if the doctor says it's okay. They made their way back to the bed, Sophie's steps growing more confident. Once she was settled, Vince helped arrange her pillows and pulled her blanket back up. Vince? Her voice was soft, hesitant. Yeah? What's going to happen to me when I leave here? Vince sat down, meeting her worried gaze. Well, I've been talking to some people. If you want, you could come live with me and the boys. Really? Hope flickered in her eyes. Really? I've already started the paperwork to adopt you. Sophie's lower lip trembled. She played with the edge of her blanket, not meeting his eyes. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Could I call you Dad? Vince felt something catch in his throat. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek as he smiled at her. Of course, sweetheart. Vince adjusted his tie for the third time, feeling uncomfortable in the formal attire. The courthouse's polished marble floors reflected the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. Ryan and Danny sat quietly beside him on the wooden bench, both dressed in their Sunday best. They'd grown stronger over the past months, their eyes brighter, their smiles more frequent. Sophie emerged from the restroom, wearing a new pale blue dress that made her eyes sparkle. Her dark hair was neatly braided, courtesy of their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had taken to helping with girl stuff that left Vince completely baffled. You look beautiful, sweetheart, Vince said, his voice rough with emotion. Sophie smiled shyly, smoothing her dress. Is it time? Before Vince could answer, Detective Miller appeared in the hallway. She'd become a regular presence in their lives, helping navigate the complex adoption process. Today, she wore a warm smile instead of her usual serious expression. Judge Harrison is ready for you, she announced. They filed into the courtroom, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The judge, kind-faced woman with silver hair, looked up from her papers as they approached. Good morning, McAllister family, she greeted them. Are we ready to make this official? Sophie nodded eagerly, reaching for Vince's hand. He squeezed it gently, remembering how far they'd come from that first meeting in the cemetery. The proceedings began, a mix of formal legal language and heartfelt moments. Judge Harrison asked Sophie if she understood what adoption meant, if this was what she wanted. Sophie's voice was clear and confident as she answered, Yes, Your Honor. I want to be part of this family forever. Vince's vision blurred as he signed the final papers. Each stroke of the pen felt monumental, transforming their makeshift family into something permanent and real. Ryan and Danny watched intently, holding hands, their faces glowing with excitement. By the power vested in me, Judge Harrison declared, I hereby confirm the adoption of Sophie Elizabeth McAllister by Vincent James. McAllister. She smiled warmly. Congratulations. It's official. Sophie threw her arms around Vince's waist, and he lifted her up, holding her close. Ryan and Danny joined the embrace, creating a tight family circle that brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the courtroom. Later that afternoon, they sat together in their backyard. The boys had helped Vince set up a small celebration, with streamers hanging from the old oak tree and Sophie's favorite chocolate cake on the picnic table. The spring air was warm and sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. Sophie sat between her new brothers, sharing silly jokes and giggling. The sound of their laughter filled the space that had once been heavy with silence and grief. Vince watched them, his heart full to bursting. For the first time in years, the weight that had pressed down on his shoulders began to lift. The darkness that had clouded their lives was finally giving way to light. His family was whole again, different from before, but somehow even more precious. Danny looked up at his father, his eyes bright. Dad, can we have some cake now? Please? Ryan and Sophie chimed in together. Vince grinned, reaching for the cake knife. As he cut generous slices for each of them, he took in the scene before him. His children, safe and happy, their future stretching out bright and full of possibility. Vince sat on the back porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The tattoos on his arms, once symbols of his rebellious past, now seemed like reminders of a different life entirely. His fingers traced the faded ink of a skull, remembering how it used to make him feel powerful, untouchable. The sound of laughter drifted through the open kitchen window, where Sophie and the boys were helping Mrs. Thompson bake cookies. The sweet smell of vanilla and chocolate wafted out, mixing with the evening air. It was such a normal, peaceful moment, the kind he never thought he'd have again. Just last week, he'd donated his old leather jacket to charity, the one with the Hells Angels patch that had been like a second skin for so many years. It hadn't been an easy decision, but as he'd held it one last time, he'd realized it no longer fit who he was. The man who'd worn that jacket wouldn't have known what to do with homework help, bedtime stories, or Sophie's request for pink walls in her new bedroom. The screen door creaked behind him, and tiny footsteps approached. Danny sat down beside him, cookie crumbs on his shirt. His son's eyes were clearer now, less haunted than they'd been months ago. "Dad," Danny said softly, leaning against Vince's arm. "Can we go to the park tomorrow? Sophie's never been on the big swing set." Vince wrapped his arm around Danny's shoulders, marveling at how natural the gesture felt now. "Of course we can, buddy." He paused, remembering a time when touching his own sons had seemed impossible, when they'd flinched away from every movement. "How about we pack a picnic too?" Ryan appeared at the door, Sophie right behind him. "Can we bring the soccer ball?" Ryan asked, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "And the frisbee?" Sophie added, her eyes bright with excitement. Vince stood up, gathering his children close. These simple requests, this easy conversation, they were miracles he'd never take for granted. Each smile, every casual touch, was a victory over the darkness that had nearly destroyed them all. Inside, Mrs. Thompson was cleaning up the kitchen, humming softly. She'd become like family, stepping in to help when Vince had felt overwhelmed by the challenges of raising a daughter. She smiled at him now, understanding in her eyes. "Cookie dough all over my kitchen," she said with a laugh. "But look at those happy faces. Worth every mess, isn't it?" Vince nodded, watching as his children gathered supplies for tomorrow's picnic. Ryan was carefully wrapping sandwiches, while Danny and Sophie argued playfully about which cookies to pack. There was flour in Sophie's hair, chocolate on Danny's nose, and pure joy in Ryan's laugh. The angry man who'd stood at his son's grave would never have believed this moment possible. That man had been consumed by grief, lost in a world of violence and revenge. But love had changed him, transformed him into someone who could heal instead of hurt, protect instead of destroy. Sophie looked up from her cookie selection, catching his eye. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm perfect, sweetheart," he replied. And for once, it wasn't a lie. Perfect not because everything was fixed. There were still nightmares, still moments of fear and uncertainty. But perfect because they were together, learning to trust and love again. The evening settled around them, peaceful and warm. Tomorrow they would go to the park, and Vince would watch his children play, their laughter a testament to the healing power of family. The kitchen bustled with activity as Vince pulled a steaming casserole from the oven. The rich aroma of melted cheese and herbs filled the air, mixing with the scent of fresh bread. Danny and Ryan were setting the table, carefully placing the mismatched plates they'd collected from thrift stores, their own special tradition since starting their new life together. Sophie danced around them, her pigtails bouncing as she carried napkins to each place setting. "Can I sit next to you tonight, Dad?" she asked, her eyes bright with hope. "Of course you can, sweetheart," Vince replied, his voice gentle. He watched as she meticulously folded each napkin into triangles, just like Mrs. Thompson had taught her. Ryan reached for the water pitcher, his movements more confident now. Gone was the trembling that had marked his early days home. "I got straight A's on my math test today," he announced, a hint of pride in his voice. "That's amazing, buddy," Vince beamed, remembering the hours they'd spent at the kitchen table, working through problems together, Those moments of frustration had turned into victories, one small step at a time. Danny emerged from his room with a piece of paper clutched in his hands. "I drew something in art class," he said quietly, but his eyes sparkled with excitement. He laid the drawing on the table, a colorful picture of 4 people holding hands under a sunny sky. Their family. Vince's throat tightened with emotion as he studied the artwork. Just months ago, Danny's drawings had been dark, filled with shadows and fear. Now, bright colors dominated the page. They gathered around the table, the chairs scraping against the floor as they settled in. Sophie reached for Vince's hand on one side and Ryan's on the other, starting their nightly tradition of saying grace. The simple prayer was more than words. It was a moment of connection, of gratitude for finding each other. "Pass the bread, please," Danny asked, his voice carrying across the table without hesitation. It was such a normal request. But Vince remembered the days when Danny had been too afraid to speak at all. The conversation flowed naturally now, filled with stories about school, friends, and future plans. Sophie chatted about her upcoming dance recital, while Ryan described a new book he'd discovered at the library. Danny contributed quietly but steadily, his shell of silence gradually cracking open to reveal the bright spirit within. Vince watched them all, his heart full. The tattoos on his arms no longer felt like chains binding him to his past, but rather reminders of how far he'd come. His son's laughter, once lost, now filled their home. Sophie's presence completed their family in ways he never could have imagined. The evening light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over their dinner table. This was more than just a meal. It was a celebration of their journey together, of wounds healing and trust rebuilt. Every shared smile, every casual touch, every moment of ordinary family life was extraordinary to Vince. As Sophie told a joke that made Ryan snort milk through his nose and Danny giggled uncontrollably, Vince felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. This was what he'd been searching for all along, even when he didn't know it. This was where they belonged. Looking at his children's faces, bright with joy and security, Vince whispered softly, "We're home. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day."